Fantastic. Matt, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, everybody. And while I get set up, could you guys just do me a huge favor and just stand up in your seats for a second? Just stand up in front of you. This is not like a TED-style engagement thing. I just felt so good walking up here that I just thought everyone's probably had a long day, could use a stretch. Sitting's the new smoking. I don't want to be responsible for that. So whenever you're good and awkward feeling or comfortable, just have a seat.
Do we say Om?
Yeah, right. Whatever your personal mantra is, go for it. Yeah, doesn't that feel better? Oh, I sit down all day, so I know I would appreciate that. So, as Matt was saying, I wanted to talk a little bit about data for the greater good. And what's interesting is I want to talk about what it's like to apply our trade to social sector issues, which often has less to do with data and technology and more with politics and people and some of the fun, unexpected things we're facing out there. So what I'd like to do is just give you guys a quick overview of what we do at DataKind, talk about some of the things that we're seeing out on the front lines, some of the interesting ethical issues, and then I'm hoping to gun to Q&A because, honestly, that's the more interesting part. I want to hear what you guys are thinking. I already know this talk, so I'm pretty excited to hear that piece of the talk. So to give you the quick background, DataKind really started because we live in revolutionary times, right? I think everyone in this room recognizes this is not hyperbole, right? There's more cell phones out there now on the earth than there are people. Almost everything we do online is tracked and monitored, as some people probably know better than others. We're instrumenting our bodies, right, so we can measure everything from our heartbeats to what tugs at our heartstrings. And we're surrounding our globe in sensors from land, air, to sea. This goes beyond our day jobs, right? This is not what the world looked like 10 years ago. This is an age in which almost every interaction we have with our world and with each other takes place with a digital interface in between. There's so much data out there that this is not just about new, more efficient business. This is virtually a new age of reason. We could understand more about our place with each other, our patterns of society, our very place in the cosmos. And so far, we've gotten super good at using all of that abundant data to help people buy crap. Now, whether it's Amazon's recommendation algorithms or Netflix helping us pick better movies, we're pretty good in Wall Street and Silicon Valley at building things to sell things. And that's not bad, don't get me wrong. This is my account. I love my Snuggie. I wouldn't have it any other way. But if we're truly in this age of reason, doesn't it seem like we could do more with that data than just make sure that never again does Netflix recommend Transformers to you when you really wanted to see Pacific Rim? It seemed like we could be doing more. As a data scientist myself, I came out of the New York Times R&D lab. I thought, there's so much potential. How could we actually start using data for good? And one of the pieces of the secret sauce that allowed us to do that, beyond just the fact that we as data scientists are enthusiastic, all of us are doing side projects. I know you've all been to hackathons. We're all working on the side anyway. The other half of that equation is that groups that you don't think of as data companies are suddenly becoming data companies, including groups like this. There's a group called Kalima Salama, and they provide microloans to farmers in Africa. And I love these guys as an example because to me, this is what big in big data means. It's not velocity or variety. It's about the expansiveness. The fact that every field is being touched by data. And so because these guys deliver microloans over cell phones, they are awash in data. They've got data about every single interaction they have with a farmer. They can probably build predictive models of when someone's going to need a claim. And more than just the data they're collecting, they've got weather data, they've got government census data, they've got crop prices. So they've got this incredible opportunity to start using data science and machine learning to improve their own efforts so that we could all have this great societal impact. The problem is they have no one to help them do that. Data scientists are expensive, and even if you just plopped a data scientist in with a lot of these nonprofits, they wouldn't know what to do with one. This is a very new resource to most of the world, and it can be a real challenge to understand how to use all that great potential, which right now is just getting lost. So that's why we founded DataKind as a nonprofit that would team up pro bono data scientists, people who wanted to volunteer their time anytime from a weekend to a 6-month project, all the way to working on a full-time, full-day job project to use data in the service of humanity. And it's been a pretty great program so far. We've seen a number of engagements across our 3 years of existence. And the cool thing that you see out of every project is that you give a chance for us data scientists to give back, have a little bit of social impact. But more than that, you see these social organizations maximize their impact. And then in the process, we all get to live in a better world. So it's a pretty good deal. And I'll give you just a few examples of what some of these projects look like. So the first comes out of a group called DonorsChooseorg. Many people may know. They're right here in New York. If you haven't heard of them, they're basically a Kickstarter for public schools. So teachers can go online and say, hey, I want to buy something for my class. I can't afford it. Here's Mrs. Boston asking for a student classroom dissection kit. And it works pretty well. People can donate and give money to it. What DonorsChoose realized is they're actually sitting on the largest database of school requests around public schools in the US. No one's ever looked at that data before, no one else has it. And so they wanted to know, how could we answer questions like, which schools are asking for the most tablets? Fundamental, basic exploratory questions. Say, based on poverty level, what kinds of things do schools ask for? And the challenge that they faced, of course, is that if you want to go up to sort of the above product level category, if you want to know all the tablets people are asking for, the challenge many of us probably face is, in the database, right, this is the actual product SKUs that these products have. Nothing tells you that this is a tablet. And what's even worse is you can order these from different organizations. So if you order this from Best Buy or Amazon, they have their own taxonomies for where these fall. So it can be very tough to figure out what exactly, where all these products lie in a taxonomy. So we built a data science team to join DonorsChoose temporarily. And they basically actually threw a couple of heuristic tricks that we could talk about later using something called semantics 3. If people aren't familiar with that, helps you do like product taxonomy. They actually were able to solve this problem and classify the objects in DonorsChoose's database. And from that data, they could see some pretty unsurprising but really important things. So this is a quick tree map of what the poverty levels of different schools are asking for. So the lowest poverty schools, in other words, the richest schools are on the bottom here, going all the way up to the highest poverty. And each of these squares, of course, is a tile representing how proportionally they ask for different things. And the takeaway here in this slide is that touchscreen tablet accessories are asked for most by the most well-off schools, which diminishes as you go to the highest poverty, who don't ask for that at all. Not a huge surprise. And probably unsurprisingly, you see the opposite story when you look for basic goods, like paper. So here the poorest schools are asking for paper the most, and you see that taper off until you see the most well-off schools aren't asking for that at all. No surprise, poorest schools ask for more basic things. But the reason it was surprising or interesting is because DonorsChoose set out to be a luxury service. Why we want to get schools things that they could never otherwise afford. And this corroborated stories that DonorsChoose was hearing that some teachers were saying, I have to go to the bathroom to get toilet paper for my students to write on because we don't even have basic supplies. And so what's cool about this is that DonorsChoose is now taking these findings and they're actually becoming an advocacy group. So they are lobbying lawmakers and decision makers to say, hey, did you know this is going on in your school systems? We have this data that once we analyze, we're able to find these findings. Let's get more funding to these schools. So that was interesting to me. They use it not just to improve their service, but actually for advocacy. Another cool project coming out of New York is this group Crisis Text Line. And if you're not familiar with them, the basic concept here is that teens don't call crisis lines anymore. If you're in trouble or you're suicidal, people used to call like the 9 line. But now teens text. Nobody calls. And so Crisis Text Line is a service where you can text if you're a teen in need, and you can be connected to a counselor who can help you out. So these guys were sitting on about 4 million text messages. This is their data analyst, Bob Philbin and Noel from Pivotal, who joined up on this project. And they were wondering, how could we use that data to create more efficient services? And so one of the things they found, they looked at a number of issues that allowed them to actually analyze as someone came in, based on their texting history, what was the best course of action. But one of the most really effective findings that they found was that repeat users are a huge drain on the system. So it's something like 5% of the people that call into these crisis lines take 40% of the resources. They're calling back because they're lonely or because they didn't have their problem answered, and it just sucks up a lot of time that could be used helping others in need. Now, DonorsChoose had a rule that, Crisis Text Line had a rule that after about 15 calls, you were considered a frequent texter, you were cut off, you were sent to a different service. But what they're able to do is actually build a model that classified the people that fell into that category. And now with a little bit of analysis, they're actually able to predict with pretty high confidence after about, I think it's about 5 calls, when someone's going to be a repeat texter. And what that means is they can handle them differently. Now about 5% of the people take up 3% of the resources. They can help other people. And kind of the cherry on top is that the repeat texters are actually reporting a better experience on the service because they're dealt with faster. So you can almost think that a repeat texter is not someone who's just texting back because they need that help, but they're kind of being funneled to the wrong place. So this was sort of a great example where, it's a basic analytics finding, but you're actually saving lives just from something as simple as that. And I'll give you one last example from a group called Give Directly. And these guys give cash transfers directly to the poorest in Kenya and Uganda. And the way they do that is they have to figure out where are the poorest villages in Kenya and Uganda. And that data doesn't exist based on a government survey. So what they have to do is they actually go door to door, and they look at the roof types of the buildings in each village. If you have a thatched roof, you're a little bit less off than someone, not as well off as someone who has an iron roof. That's a pretty good system, but it means you have to send people out, to walk around a country and figure these things out. And so they said, man, is there any way we can do this any faster? It takes like 100 days. So of course you might imagine, Google Maps and satellite imagery are pretty good at spotting thatched roofs versus iron roofs. You can see this kind of cluster over here of thatched roofs compared to this iron roof. So a team from IBM and Mozilla basically built a classification algorithm that would find the different roof types. It's an interesting regression model we could talk about later. But what it allowed them to do was basically build this map of roofiness. I'll be a proper statistician and not say poverty, but say a roofiness map to estimate poverty in about 2 hours. And the cool thing about this is GiveDirectly is not the only one who could use this. There's lots of other groups who want to know what poverty levels are in different areas. And kind of the nice thing, a little cherry on top for these guys, is that that team was actually awarded the best social good paper at KDD. So it's kind of cool because they signed up just to do a volunteer project and then were sort of honored for this work that is now being spread. So that's the basic gist of how DataKind works. I could talk all day about the different projects. We've done over 60. We've got over 7,000 volunteers around the world. And recently we expanded to 6 international chapters. These are our chapter leaders here doing this work in their own cities. And be more than happy to talk about how different it is to see doing data for good work in San Francisco, where you've got all the tech talent, but maybe a frayed relationship with the community, versus Singapore, with a whole big data initiative from the government. So that's most of the work that we do. And I would be remiss not to use my time on the stage to mention that we are also hiring. So if anyone wants to lead one of the largest pro bono global data science consultancies with us, we're looking for a pretty high level role. So come talk to me, go to datakind.org. But more than that, instead of just talking about cool projects, I wanted to sort of close with some of the things we're seeing that are actually interesting challenges when we actually try to apply data science to these social sector issues. And of course, one of the things you should note is that most of these solutions are not super high tech. Right? There's one project we're working on police body cams with video that I'm definitely going to talk to David about afterwards. But most of these groups really just need basic exploratory analysis, data that's never been mined that could be really effective. And because of that, one of the things that we've seen is that data science for good really needs good design. Now, all of the things I'm about to talk about are super obvious, but also bear repeating. So this comes up because a lot of groups come to us and say, hey, give us a cool data for good problem. We've got data scientists, let's hack on a cool data set, let's help the world. And that's an okay attitude, but as you might imagine, most data science for good projects follow most of the projects that we do every day. They require a lot of user design. And so this is actually related to that GiveDirectly project that I talked about. This was a tool that the teams built to help label some of the training data. So what you can see here is volunteers were able to crowdsource clicking on the types of roofs that were in each of these images so that the team could build an algorithm. And they went ahead, they identified all the thatched roofs, they identified the iron roofs, and in the end, they built this regression model that's getting something like 95% accuracy. Huzzah! The crowdsourcing took only about 2 hours. We're feeling great. We sent it out to GiveDirectly. We said, here are the villages you need to go to. They came back a couple months later and they're like, this is crazy. We're going to what you say are the poorest villages, and they're some of the wealthiest villages we've ever seen. What the hell did you do? And we're like, oh, what did we do? So we went back to it, we looked at the training data, sure, we looked at how we've been told to label the images, it looks right, everything's looking right, the algorithm runs, we tried some different models. It was only when we actually talked to someone who was on the ground there who showed us how they would interpret these images. And they said, oh, yeah, these things over here, they have thatched roofs, but they're not houses. Actually, when you have a mansion, it will often have kitchens that are thatched. Sometimes the wealthiest son, yeah, right? The wealthiest son goes and lives in a thatched roof house next to the main house. So all of this context was sort of, lost in the process. And so we're actually going back and redoing that project with that knowledge, which in retrospect is a basic project specification issue, right? But getting to that level with a group that is around the world with a volunteer organization becomes it's a very critical part, but very difficult to do. So I think it's very important to note this is not just hacking on cool data. It's a hugely iterative, people-based process, which takes a lot of design work. As almost an asterisk to that, I would say one of the other things we're seeing that's really interesting is there are a lot of, I'd say, hammers popping up everywhere in need of nails. In other words, data science for good comes from some unexpected places. And one of the projects that often makes me think of this is a project called 43,123 pools I have not visited and never will. And I'm curious, how many people are familiar with this project? Oh, awesome. I usually get 0 hands, so 4 is like huge. So for those of you who haven't seen it, this is a project where this guy was flying into Los Angeles. And he looks out his window and he goes, my God, there are so many swimming pools in Los Angeles. I wonder how many swimming pools there are. And like usually you just think about this and go have a bar bet with your friends. But he's like, no, I'm going to solve this. So he writes a little classifier. It goes and runs over Google Images and it finds all the swimming pools, right? It's a swimming pool classifier. But then he goes one step further and he actually hooks it up to Google Street View and actually builds a virtual tour of all the swimming pools in Los Angeles. Because what else would you want to see? You know, wouldn't that be interesting? And so what you're going to see here, I swear I'll not show you all 43,123, is a tour of Los Angeles' swimming pools. So here we are. It's a beautiful sunny day in LA, and we're driving in. Oh, there's one back there. Awesome. Swimming pool in the back. Oh, and he estimated the dimensions, in case you're curious about that. Right, goofy, silly, kind of interesting, socially relevant. And of course, you can see we're off to the next one down Waverly Drive. And oh, there it is back there, one of those horrible condominium pools, like a possum in the back. So this is how you can get the idea. This is how this video goes. Now, two things interesting about this video to me. Number one is that this guy didn't do this at work. He didn't do it with the government. He just sat at home with his laptop and figured this out. And that's really interesting to me because you're seeing more and more of this, right? Where we don't have to make change just from work. We have the computing power and the data that's out there to build things like this just sitting at home in our underpants. And that's awesome. But the other really cool thing about this is that there's actually a social good twist to it. And so I'll throw it out to you guys. If you had a database of all the swimming pool locations in LA, what social good applications could that have?
Water use.
Water use, exactly. Southern California is going through a huge water shortage. It's a huge issue. Water usage could be good. Sometimes people say fire prevention. So there's all these, interesting uses of this data set. The one that actually this ultimately ended up getting used for was outside of the US for actually doing malaria prevention. So it turns out that stagnant pools are a huge issue for malaria. And so people use a similar algorithm to find these pools and drain them and reduce malaria. So this is really interesting because we're in a world now where you can kind of see these interesting projects popping up that could be used for social good. And the last thing I'll close on, because I'm hitting time here, is a little bit about ethics. And I'll say this quickly because I don't think of ethics as privacy and openness, Ed Snowden stuff. I really think of this line from Marshall McLuhan. We become what we behold. We shape our tools, and then our tools shape us. And that was written back in the day when we were talking about hammers and physical products, but I think it's even more important as we all write algorithms as these kind of invisible layer defining the decision space for people. And classic examples of this that come up are Microsoft's patent to avoid crime-ridden neighborhoods. Great idea. I don't want to go to crime-ridden neighborhoods if I'm in a new town, but invariably this creates a divide where people with fancy cell phones avoid poor areas. And I'm not saying that's good or bad, but it's an interesting kind of unintentional consequence. Or when Microsoft's Kinect was accused for being racist because it couldn't identify dark-skinned faces. Now, computer vision is hard. Maybe that was the challenge. Or, do you kind of wonder, like maybe this was just tested in Seattle and they just tried it on whoever was around? I don't know that that's the case, but maybe, right? These unintended cultural and social biases are making their way into tools that are going to shape the way people work. And beyond just the, frivolity of a Kinect, we face this problem building a project with Amnesty International, predicting human rights violations. Built a great logistic model that would help us understand, based on the severity of a report of a human rights violation, which ones Amnesty International go after first. And it was great, and the classification accuracy was high. And we handed it over, and we started to sweat. Because we had that moment that was like, what if this doesn't work? How will they know? What did we not think of? We're not in Jordan being held prisoner. What things aren't we thinking about? And how will other people be able to use these tools when they're not exactly sure what success looks like? Now, this is an extreme case, but I think that's something that we as algorithm designers are creating across the world and really begs the question, at least thinking about, what kind of bias are we creating and how do we even expose that? So lastly, I'll just say, everyone here, I think, understands the age that we're in, but I always use this analogy to explain it to like my grandmother and other people out there, because I think one of the best things we can do is demystify data science. And I think this is the most beautiful analogy I've ever heard. It's from a guy, Joel de Rosnay, 1979, in a book called The Macroscope. And he said, since time immemorial, humans have built tools to help them see what they can't see. So in the old days, we built a telescope to see the infinitely great, the cosmos, the planets, things that were so far away. It's beautiful. We learned so much about our place in the universe. And then we built a microscope, so let's just see the infinitesimally small microbes, bacteria all around us. Fantastic. But in 1979, he said, what we're missing is something like a macroscope, something to look at the infinitely complex, the patterns of society and nature that you can't just observe. And so we're in that age now where we can't observe 9 trillion credit card transactions, we can't observe 1 billion tweets or human migratory patterns, but we have, with data and algorithms, we have that macroscope. So that's sort of my call to you guys. Hopefully that sparked some ideas, but I hope that as all of us go out there wielding that macroscope, we get involved in thinking about what interesting things we can look at. Because really only when all of us get involved, everyone in this room is a data scientist, everyone who's out there is a decision maker, who's a university or a foundation, it's only as we all come together to start using these skills towards these challenges, they're going to go beyond just using data to make better decisions about what kind of movies we want to see, and actually start making better decisions about what kind of a world we want to see. So thank you very much. Hope to see you out there. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. I guess I'm sure you're overwhelmed with requests. How do you select?
Oh, that's a great question. So we're actually overwhelmed with requests on both sides. We have about 10,000 volunteers in the database looking for projects. Sorry if you're one of them. And hundreds of organizations coming in. So we tend to actually select based on the project first. So we spend a lot of time consulting up front. Organizations will come in, we'll say, what's your challenge, what's your data, let's craft a project. And then we actually do kind of a top-down match of who's got the right skills for the project that we're looking for. It's actually not as data-driven as I would like it to be, but cobbler's kids go without shoes.
Okay, great. Questions?
My first question is, how do you, obviously you're dealing with a lot of data. Now there's a lot of companies are putting together data governance departments, to manage their data. And are you working with governments to set up some kind of data governance and ethics on how data can be used?
It's interesting you ask about that. So a lot of the way that we sort of try to shift people's viewpoints is through project-based work. So in some ways, yes. We've been working with governments who will often come and say, hey, we've got all this data. We want to make it open, or we want to do something with it, which often is sort of to me, kind of the wrong question. I think open data is a great first step, but then and governance is a part of that. But really understanding what you want to do with it is a much bigger question and sort of should shape that process. So what we'll often do is say, well, let's work with you kind of before you open it all up. Let's see what's there. Let's see what's possible. And then from that, let's talk about what you want to open and what standards you want to put around that. Because that's really, one of my sort of pet peeves is that open data right now is incredibly supply driven. There's this idea like we've got data, let's make it open and the technologists will figure it out. So I think as much as we can play with it first to sort of understand the demand, I think helps shape that. So that's some of the work we do. And I'd be remiss not to mention that if you guys aren't familiar with Data and Society here in New York, it's a great think tank headed up by Dana Boyd that does a lot of research around what ethical uses and opening of data should look like. So that was a great question.
Can you give us some examples of metrics you have in place to track your work?
Yeah, so the question for people in here is, what kind of metrics do you have to track your work? So we kind of have a tiered structure, and it's funny, at the very top level is almost impossible, but so critical, which is how much of an impact have we made on the problem? So if we're trying to do poverty alleviation, how many fewer people are there living in extreme poverty? That's incredibly tough to measure, or even worse than that, actually draw causal inferences that our individual projects actually shifted that. But we're always on the quest to try. But sort of the level below that actually comes down to organizational efficiency. So let's say that you just agree that crisis text line works, right? So if crisis text line can talk to more teens, then that will reduce the number of teen suicides or improve team betterment. There's obviously a statistical study to be done there, but if you trust that last step, then the question becomes one that's a little more tangible of, well, how many people can we get through the system with a certain level of care? And so at that point, it becomes an operational efficiency. Sometimes that's a bit qualitative, as in, what insight drove a decision such that they became more effective. But that's really sort of our sweet spot, is understanding that. Because if we can't show an organization's improvement, then we can't show our value. And then sort of below that, there's just service level metrics. So did volunteers have a good time? Did they get what they came for? Was it an easy engagement? Did the nonprofits like it? So that's kind of our three tiers. And we're always shooting for the top one, but trying to work our way up. That was a good question.
All right, time for one last question. We're a little over time.
I'll be around afterwards, too, if anyone has burning questions.
Hi, are you only doing projects from other organizations, or you have your own projects that you sort of take data sets and try to do on your own?
I so love that you asked that. I couldn't have set it up better. So most of the projects that we do have been kind of one-on-one engagements where an organization comes and says, I've got this challenge, how do we solve it? But what you quickly realize, if you really want to make a significant dent on a social sector issue, you kind of need to go beyond the individual organization. So poverty alleviation doesn't live with one nonprofit. So we actually just built an in-house special projects team that kind of sits in the middle of a number of data sets and challenges and tries to marry the two together. And this is very early stage, but one that we're working on is trying to look at how satellite imagery can best support resiliency efforts in cities. So we have someone just sitting with a huge data set of satellite imagery trying to say, okay, how might this be useful in the sort of bigger quest? So we've just developed that, and if people are interested, there's some stuff on our site about it, and we're always looking for more good people.
All right, wonderful. Thank you very
Great.
much.
Thank you so much, man. Appreciate it. Thanks, man.